Horrible news, horrible for Joe Biden in our new CNN poll. While the president leads his Democratic competitors by a huge margin, two-thirds of all of the American people surveyed, 66% of the public, say that a Biden victory would either be a setback or a disaster for the United States.
Now, he suggests there that Joe Biden's lead is huge. It's actually not in the context of primary challenges to a sitting president. Donald Trump had primary challengers in 2020, people like former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld and former South Carolina governor who resigned in disgrace and then ended up running for the House seat that he held, Mark Sanford, and losing in the primary. He was a joke of a candidate, and they never got anywhere near 20%, even though supposedly a significant portion of the party was found Trump so anathema. And as I said, there are a lot of polls that show Ron DeSantis at a lower number of support than Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has at 16% and 18%. I saw a South Carolina poll today where Trump was above 50% and DeSantis was at 15%. And yet everybody acknowledges, and I think they should, that there's a real Republican primary, the outcome of which we won't know until the voting is counted. But if you think that about the Republican Party, you have to think that about the Democratic Party, given that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is polling higher, in some polls at least, than Ron DeSantis, but has roughly the same level of support. And everyone regards Ron DeSantis as at least a credible primary challenger. Nobody would say Donald Trump is about a primary challenger. This is a fairy tale, a mythology that they have invented. Now, here's CNN talking about its own poll. It has this hilariously optimistic headline, quote, Biden has a lead over Democratic Party challengers, but faces headwinds overall. Quote, just a third of Americans say that Biden winning in 2024 would be a step forward or a triumph for the country. At the same time, the survey finds a decline in favorable views of Biden over the past 6 months, from 42% in December to 35% now. And results from the same poll released earlier this week showed Biden's approval rating for handling the presidency at 40%, among the lowest for any first-term president since Dwight Eisenhower at this point in their term. In other words, you have to go back to the 1950s to find a president with as low approval ratings in the first term at this point in the presidency as Joe Biden has. There's no way to certify that. Within his own party, 60% of Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters say they back Biden for the top of next year's Democratic ticket. 20% favor activist and lawyer Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and 8% back author Marianne Williamson. Another 8% said they would support an unnamed someone else. Now, one of the things I find extremely interesting about the challenge from RFK Jr. in particular, and I said this to Marianne Williamson when I had her on this show, and I'm going to have RFK Jr. on within the next week or two. We're finalizing dates. Looking forward to that discussion. Is that the way in which that last primary challenge against the Democratic incumbent proved to be successful? It wasn't just RFK Jr. who drove Lyndon Johnson out of the race, but also Eugene McCarthy, was because there was a war going on that the Democratic Party president supported, and they exploited anti-war sentiment to mount a challenge against him. Marianne Williamson has no differences or criticisms at all of Biden's war proxy war policy in Ukraine. She supports it, in fact, vehemently. But RFK Jr. is a vehement and vocal opponent of that war policy. He finds the war in Ukraine to be recklessly disastrous, recklessly dangerous, in a way that produces no benefits for the American people and all kinds of harms. But it's not just in that very important issue where he presents a stark choice, and therefore a crucial debate, where Biden would be forced to defend this war policy, even though Biden himself said it has brought the war closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any point since 1962. His own policy, that is, has done that. But also the widespread lies and errors and damage done in the name of COVID, which Biden has vehemently supported. So let Biden go before the Democratic Party electorate and justify school closures that have caused a retardation in the intellectual and emotional and cognitive development of millions of American children, or the fact that lies were told about the efficacy of cloth masks and what the vaccine would do and how it works. That's why the Democrats are petrified of a debate, because they actually have a real contrast. Now, let me say on a show a few days ago when I was just sort of talking about RFK Jr.'s candidacy in passing, I mentioned that there are certain things that I disagree with him on, including what I called his vehement support for Russiagate. His campaign got in contact with me and said they thought that was wildly overstated, even a little inaccurate, or maybe entirely inaccurate in their view. And we checked more than I did before I said that. It was kind of an off-the-cuff comment I made, and I have to say that at the very least my formulation was excessive. I don't think it's fair to call him a vehement supporter of Russiagate. You can find a couple of tweets that can be interpreted as supportive and a couple of tweets that are skeptical, and I'm going to refrain from characterizing that any further until I have RFK Jr. on the show, where he can talk himself about what his position was and what it is now when it comes to Russiagate. But clearly the Democrats are petrified of the debate that he brings. This is a serious person. He was an environmental lawyer for 20 years, widely regarded among the left liberals for doing an important job. He knows what he's talking about. We showed you that interview he did with Crystal Ball on Breaking Points, where she tried to tell him he was wrong on vaccines, but was ill-prepared to tell him why, and admitted he had done far more work than she had in researching it. He wrote an entire book on it that became a New York Times bestseller, filled with references to hundreds of studies and thousands of footnotes. Imagine Joe Biden having to engage him on that debate. So of course they're going to do everything possible to keep Biden hidden, like they did in 2020. But as poll numbers like this continue to grow, and he becomes a weaker and weaker and weaker candidate, barely able to speak a coherent sentence, oftentimes clearly not having any idea what he's saying, the ability to sustain this fairy tale is going to crumble even more. Now, let me show you a speech that Biden gave at the G7 just last week that was, despite him reading from a script, cringeworthy and difficult to watch, uncomfortable. Because what he was saying, the words that were coming out of his mouth, were incoherent. So imagine him trying to do that in a debate. Whatever medication they gave him in 2020 that got him through those debates seemed not to be working any longer. Listen to him try and read from a script.
And there's a lot of other, for example, the idea that we're, in terms of taxes, that they refuse to, for example, I was able to balance the budget and pass everything from the global warming bill. Anyway, I was able to cut by $1.7 billion in the first 2 years the deficit that we were accumulating. And because I was able to say to it that the 55 corporations in America that made $400 billion, or $400 billion, that they pay zero in tax, zero.
That was a 40-second clip. He mentioned no fewer than 7 issues, none of which had anything to do with the prior one. He threw out numbers that made no sense, that were clearly wrong. He had no idea what those numbers meant. He continuously interrupted himself with like whatever and moving on. He couldn't complete a sentence. Even though this was scripted, you see him here reading the speech, looking down. He had a script in front of him. He couldn't even read from it. His cognitive decline is something that was alerted to, warned about, trumpeted, not by Trump supporters or Bernie Sanders supporters in 2018 when he was gearing up to run, but by Democratic insiders on Morning Joe, who were petrified he was going to get the nomination due to name recognition, only to be able to be exposed as somebody whose brain is melting. That was 5 years ago. This is going to be another year and a half, another year before he starts running. How are they going to present him, prop him up in order to make him even acceptable to watch, let alone people willing to vote for him again? And if he has to go through the rigors of a Democratic primary, where he gets exposed even more, where he gets weakened even more, where his energy is devoted to that, where he gets exposed like this over and over, it is very hard to see how he ends up as even a viable candidate, let alone one that Democrats are going to have confidence in, but Democratic voters themselves see it. It's very possible the more they learn about RFK Jr. and his position on vaccines, that support will disappear. But Democratic voters clearly are petrified of supporting and nominating Joe Biden and are very uncomfortable watching him and extremely unfavorable about how he's governing this country, let alone independents and Republicans. To the point where even CNN is calling polling data disastrous. Now,